Hi, everybody. I'm Noreen McDonald. Thank you so much for making time to be here today. And thanks to Ondine for organizing all parts of the webinar. Charles Edwards, who I think you can also see on the video, and I are going to be presenting today on planning for urban freight delivery and looking at how city codes accommodate freight. And this work grows out of both Charles's work in North Carolina and really globally on freight, as well as some research that we recently completed with Quan Yan, who was a postdoctoral scholar at the University of North Carolina. And so I do want to say Ondine is going to be monitoring the chat box, so please feel free to go ahead, enter any questions that you might have in there. We should have plenty of time today, so we have the formal question and answer part at the end. But if there is something that needs to be clarified while we're going, Ondine will let us know, so please feel free to do that. And so this webinar is by Stride, but this work was also funded by Stride. And so Stride is one of the university transportation centers. It focuses on the southeastern part of the United States. You can see all of the participating universities here, so it really covers a wide part of our region. And so a very useful organization that's really focused on connecting at the state level, the MPO level, as well as the local level. So thanks to Stride for doing this. The focus of the Stride Center is on reducing congestion, and I think you'll see the linkages as we move through the presentation here. So before we get going, before I tell you what we're going to focus on today, I did want to start by introducing ourselves. So I'm the department chair at Carolina for the City and Regional Planning Program. And then I'll ask Charles if you could just introduce yourself.
Sure. Good morning, everybody. I'm Charles Edwards. As you can see, I practice part-time as a professor under Noreen, formerly with the DOT, helped develop the Freight and Logistics Division, was with the DOT for about 3 to 4 years, developing their freight-focused efforts. And I think, as Noreen mentioned earlier, have been engaged in freight actually all my life, and have studied and moved freight pretty much everywhere in the world. So looking forward to this presentation and your questions.
Great, thanks, Charles. So moving on, this is just a brief overview to give you a sense of how we'll structure today's webinar. First, we'll talk a little bit about the background on urban freight. I'm guessing for many of you, this is something you're sort of overly familiar with, some of the issues related to goods movement in our communities. And then we'll talk about our research project, which focused on city zoning codes and how cities are implementing both on and off street parking. And one element that you'll see come throughout this part of the talk is that we are really focused on the supply for freight provision in our communities and how that comes and is developed through the planning process. Next, Charles is going to talk about some of the experiences in North Carolina, and then finally we'll wrap up by talking about some of the strategies, and hopefully that will naturally lead into our Q&A session, and ideally we could also learn some of the strategies that you may have been implementing in your communities. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and get started then, starting with the background. So, you know, the increase in demand for urban deliveries is only rising, both to serve businesses in our urban cores or our suburban communities, but also, as we probably have all experienced very much recently, to serve consumer needs as well, as we increasingly order products to be delivered to our homes. And most of us during COVID probably amped up a little bit of our purchases, or even became a little bit more aware of how the freight system was functioning in that, because there was significantly more friction. There were some items that you may have purchased on Amazon, which had longer than usual delivery times. And so just sort of highlighting this critical issue of goods movement in cities, evergreen issue around moving it to businesses, but on the consumer side, that rapidly growing. And you can see a quote here of Fort Lee, New Jersey. Each resident received about 1.5 packages per week. You can decide whether you fall above or below that average in Fort Lee, but most of us may be edging kind of above it now, or at least during certain periods. And so the issue is that with all of those needs to get goods to the end user, delivery vehicles often face insufficient freight infrastructure, particularly in the densest areas, but even in some suburban communities as well. And so this is a quote focused on Seattle. 87% of all the buildings in the core areas rely on the curbs and alleys to receive deliveries. There's fairly limited dedicated off-street loading infrastructure. And so what that then leads to is some of the images that you see here where trucks may be double parked, or their efficiency of their delivery is then impacted because they're unable to find spaces for loading. There is also a number of issues with how the infrastructure, particularly the on-street infrastructure for freight that is provided, how it's utilized. And so for the most part, it's used by a lot of other uses, including passenger vehicles that may be occupying it, even if it's marked for goods movement. This is data from Brazil, but there's been similar studies carried out in many cities globally. I think Paris actually did a study where they found that its usage by freight was only 6% of the time. And so you can think about in your communities, what do you think that usage is? And what would be optimal? Clearly there's not a need for 100%, but how do you manage that curb space? And so increasingly this competition over the street space is very intense, with issues about which modes or which types of uses should have increasing rights, how you interact and do so in a safe manner. There's not in this project, but in separate ones, we've been looking at some of the road safety impacts of urban freight deliveries, and in some large cities, some of those complex interactions with pedestrians and cyclists and automobiles is one that's receiving more attention. So loading spaces. Loading spaces ended up being the focus of our research project, because when we went and looked at the literature, while I think it's easy to argue that overall freight doesn't get nearly as much attention in the transportation community as it deserves, what we saw is that freight demand in terms of usage, there's been some really innovative studies recently actually following delivery drivers and looking at where they're going and how long they're spending, what their dwell times are, how long it takes them to deliver every package. All of that is really focused on the demand side. And we saw less work looking at the supply side. How do we currently end up with loading docks on some buildings but not on others? How do we decide where to put on-street spaces? And so that was the focus of our research. We decided to look to better understand how cities are approaching this, because it is those loading spaces both on and off street that become this critical infrastructure for delivery. So off-street loading spaces, these would generally be regulated by the city's zoning code and often be specified and need to be reviewed when a building was going through site review and being approved by the local government. And so for this, we were able to focus and review those codes. On-street spaces is an issue about curb allocation. And so the management of this is much more complex. It varies from city to city. And many of you might be able to share your experience with how it's done in your community. So what we went ahead and did to understand both on-street and off-street loading and how we generate that supply. First, for off-street, we focused on reviewing the zoning codes for 4 cities in North Carolina and the 10 largest cities in the US, just to kind of get some variation. They're all in very different environments, different states, different governing regulations. How are they approaching this? As I said, on-street is much more complicated. Sometimes it's managed by the police, sometimes it's managed by the transportation department, sometimes it's managed by public works. It's kind of all over the map. So for that, we really went and talked to people in each of those cities to understand how it was carried out in their community. And some of what they thought was working, and also what some of the challenges were. So the next slide, I'll start showing you some of the results that we found. And I'm going to start first with our off-street analysis. So I'll take a little bit of time to orient you to the slide because there is a lot going on here. So up top, you can see that we have the US top 10 cities by population. So New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, Houston, Phoenix, Philadelphia, San Antonio, San Diego, Dallas, San Jose, and then in North Carolina, we looked at Charlotte, Raleigh, Durham, and Greensboro. And so, you know, we did focus on the city as our unit of analysis because most of these policies are controlled at the city level rather than at the metropolitan level. There'd be a substantial amount of variation at the metropolitan level. And then to give you a better sense, we went through and then came up with a couple of average sized businesses. An average Starbucks is about 2,000 feet, McDonald's 4,000, Whole Foods nearly 40,000 square feet. And we went and looked at, for these communities, what were their zoning codes require in terms of loading zones. And you can see the results here. So for the most part, a sort of Starbucks type of size location wouldn't require, in most cities, any freight provision. Similarly for McDonald's, and then once we get into these much larger uses, 20,000 square feet, 40,000 square feet, you can see the requirements laid out there. But if you compare those to, say, the parking requirements that are imposed on development, the freight provision is much more minimal. Some things to call out that we saw, there's a fair amount of variation. So looking at the off-street loading requirements, what we saw was much more flexibility. So one, thinking about the joint sharing of the loading spaces, that was something that came up in the cities that you see listed there. And then more refined requirements for small and medium-sized businesses, as well as multiple options on size. And so some of that was then embedded in the zoning code or embedded in how the planners reviewed the documents. So if we look to off-street loading requirements for residential, so we have those same 14 cities across the top, and then some representative development types, a small condo apartment up into a large condo apartment listed here. And you can see what the off-street requirements would be. Now, this is an interesting area because our review of the zoning code showed that most cities probably hadn't updated this section of their code in a while. However, there's been substantial changes in freight trip generation at residences, right? Particularly multi-story apartment buildings, as we may have here. So this is an interesting area, as many of us shop more through Amazon Amazon and providers, the demand for this freight delivery has really increased on the residential side in a way that probably has not fully filtered through the zoning codes. So you can see the requirements here, again, relatively limited requirements for small condos. For the large condo building required about 1 or 2. And just some comments on that. Many cities don't have any requirements at all for residential land uses. And similar to the conversation about minimum parking requirements, there can be reasons for that. Trying not to raise the cost of housing production is really a primary one. And then we saw very different variations in terms of, did they focus on the number of units, gross square footage, density of units? The codes were written differently. So the next slide that I'll show moves on to what we found for on-street loading provision. So as I said, this is what came through in the interviews that we did with engineers, planners in different cities. So I think the main takeaway, and I'm guessing it's sort of what most of you would assume, was that it's a relatively ad hoc process. That in most cities, it's based on businesses requesting space near them because of their needs, or a set of businesses coming together to do that. And so it's not necessarily something that local governments plan for, but rather it's based on demand from the local business community, or potentially also citizens as well. And so that leads to a sort of natural unevenness. It's also managed, as I said earlier, in different parts of the city government, from enforcement to transportation, to public works, and you can see examples of that. So on the next slide, we have just some images from different websites about, this is from Philadelphia, an example of the application that you have to fill out if you're interested in requesting a loading zone in front of your business. And so I think the conversation about on-street is really critical, because in some ways it's the most flexible type of freight infrastructure that we have. It's can be created on the fly, it can be removed on the fly based on local government decisions, based on the feedback they're getting from the community. It doesn't necessarily generate curb cuts, which can be an issue for interfering with pedestrian flows. So some of the off-street have problems with that. It doesn't create necessarily some dead zones, which, depending on the design, some of the off-street can impact the urban environment. And so it's interesting that this is both so highly useful, but so difficult to plan for in terms of the on-street provision. So what we also, are my slides still showing?
Yep, they
Okay,
are.
good. And so what we saw is some of this complexity around the focus of different community types in the urban core and different land uses, and the difficulty of communities to plan, because freight trip generation is very land use specific, but yet land uses change over time. And so it's, how do you manage that effectively without imposing too many burdens during the development process? So now I'm going to turn it over to Charles, and he's going to talk about some of the experiences that North Carolina has had with these issues.
Great, thanks, Noreen. I'm actually going to leave the bullet point that's at the top to the end, and you'll understand why. When I was at the NCDOT, we actually started a process with the city of Charlotte, the Charlotte Department of Transportation, and UPS to look at some of the issues related to on-street parking, availability of spaces, utilization of spaces, etc. Because if they're more efficient, they being the delivery operations, then the flow of traffic is not impeded as much. They can provide a better level of service to whether it's residents or to businesses that are what they're making the deliveries to or picking up the packages from. Also looked at, as you can see, the street guidelines, which are pretty old. Those were the most recent that we were able to identify. And of course, e-commerce, which has been driving a lot of this activity. And you need to understand that UPS and FedEx, and I happen to have worked for both of them in the past, were never designed at the beginning to deliver to individual consumers. They were a business-to-business activity. And so they're wrestling with this tremendous avalanche of packages. And so too, we felt that, and there was a lot of interest in Charlotte, that they needed to start looking at how do they design the streets, or what are the guidelines that they put in, especially for new development, but also retrospectively. A big thing that has occurred recently is drones. UPS started a program in Raleigh on a limited basis for medical supplies that has since been expanded. They work with a number of different companies. They don't own the drones. They contract with drone manufacturers and operators. There's one in Charlotte now. There's also one in the suburban areas of the Raleigh area. That's actually with CVS, delivering medical supplies. Most of this has all been for medical supplies. In Canada, there are larger drones that are used for both medical and non-medical. But it's a way for cities and, again, the delivery companies to minimize the impact of putting another vehicle out on the road, traffic congestion, less right now for COVID, but and finding a spot, etc. There's lots of challenges with operating drones, but it's something that probably, and we feel or felt, and my colleagues who are still at DOT believe, is an opportunity. But again, cities are going to have to start to understand what air rights mean, and the interplay between air over a city. The FAA, of course, gets involved above certain altitudes, etc. But that's an opportunity. Lockers, to minimize the number of stops, both UPS and FedEx, and to an extent, Amazon have already put lockers into place. This actually first started in China in their huge, big residential developments. I use lockers a lot here in Raleigh. Not that it's more convenient because I typically have to go someplace, but I'm not worried about theft. And a lot of theft on porches, unfortunately, rises, especially in the pre-Christmas season. Opportunities. Raleigh has been undertaking a significant lane reduction program. A lot of the major streets have been downsized from 4 lanes to 2 travel lanes plus a turn lane, or from 3 travel lanes to 2 travel lanes, and widening the parking, quote unquote, areas. And that's an opportunity, although it wasn't the intent, as I understand it, of the city transportation folks. But it does potentially provide additional on-street parking that trucks, delivery and pickup operations can use, and therefore improves the flow of the traffic in those areas significantly, avoiding that picture that Noreen showed of the FedEx truck right beside the Amazon truck in Seattle. In addition, Another opportunity is NCDOT in last year finally released an updated complete streets policy. A lot of work went into it. A colleague of mine headed that. Interestingly, there was nothing in the most recent version that addresses this particular challenge, if you will. A lot about bicycles and vehicles and pedestrian interplay, but not addressing the rise of pickup and delivery operations that are really as a result of e-commerce. So what does that all mean, and what's the real challenge? Well, and there have been numerous efforts, primarily by UPS, but also FedEx and DHL, but primarily by UPS, in addressing how to better move packages in an urban environment. Quite a few of them have not progressed. They were active and then they stopped. It was a combination of code. It was a combination of that plus just an attitude of, is this really something we have to deal with? Which was very frustrating to UPS, as I understand, because they'd invested quite a bit with some of the cities and communities that they were working with. But one thing that we did find with the Charlotte project, and in general, just looking at this issue throughout North Carolina, is a lack of planning data. The companies, FedEx and UPS, DHL, Amazon, they have more data than you could believe. They know where, when, how, why, seasonality, everything. The problem is that is especially very sensitive data. And what we believe at DOT, I'll use the royal we, even though I'm retired now, is we need to come up with an approach which shelters that data, but then provides an element of the data that's needed by planners or people who are engaged in developing or redesigning codes, whatever. And there needs to be an awareness of the value of that data to the companies, but also an awareness on their part of the value of that data to the communities that they're working with. Again, using UPS as an example, but also knowing colleagues at FedEx, they understand why cities and towns want to do this. They totally embrace it. But the challenge then becomes of what are they really willing to release that will allow both sides of the equation to work together. And I think that's where a lot of effort really needs to be devoted to. And once that, not logjam, but once that situation is resolved, then I think it will give city planners, code creators, writers, a lot of good data, a better insight into what is going on, and as a result, come up with a better mousetrap, if you will. So back to you, Noreen.
Great, thanks, Charles. I hope we'll be able to come back to some of those topics, particularly about the data in the Q&A.
Yep, it's not easy, but I think with the minds on board today, we might be able to come up with some solutions.
So I said we'd, last thing that we would touch on are strategies. And I think what we came away from this project was noting, one, of course, the traditional emphasis on demand management will continue to be with us. There's, some of the simple demand management strategies about creating times of day when deliveries are allowed. Mixed effectiveness, particularly if they're not done in consultation with the business owners and delivery, but it is certainly a strategy that can be effective. There's also some really creative demand management strategies going on. London was piloting an example where, the truck would come in and drop off the packages, and then a bunch of people would pick them up and do the deliveries. So the driver wasn't doing the deliveries, which radically reduced the dwell time. You know, I don't think it's a solution that's ready to hit the market yet, but it sort of shows that we think about decoupling some of these functions that right now the driver is currently doing, and maybe decouple delivery from driving. We could reduce the dwell times in a way that would effectively increase the supply of parking spaces. But focusing then on some of this freight supply and this on and off street provision that we've looked at here, one is the enforcement question. And again, you know, it's not a simple, oh, you just need to go out and enforce, but rather through engagement with the business community, through engagement with the residential community, understanding some of the reasons that there may be violations currently, and figuring out how to come up with a more workable solution. We also think that particularly on the residential side, for large residential construction, zoning codes may need to be updated, and that could start with some looking at some of the freight trip generation rates that we see in residential buildings. That may be appropriate there, and could potentially be incorporated in some of the parking areas that many of those buildings already include. And then another one that's referenced here as a pilot program around curb space management. Several cities, including some of the ones we talked to, as well as others that we didn't talk to but have been working on this, are working with apps to do curb space management, and essentially think about how can you more efficiently and potentially more flexibly manage that curb space. How do you allow cities to make decisions a little bit more rapidly, to understand where the demand patterns are, and to allocate more freight infrastructure there, and potentially also to monetize it by working with some of these app developers. And so, you know, there's been experiments, as I said, in several cities. You know, I think COVID has probably put a little bit of a hold on a lot of movements that were going in this direction, but that is certainly probably a direction we will continue to see, because the on-street is just so critical and addresses most of our freight infrastructure problems we can address through the development approval process, because for the most part, the built environment is largely constructed. So just to wrap up, trying to make a case to think about the freight infrastructure supply by thinking about city policies on and off street loading zones, and a time to think about updating our approach to that from zoning codes that may not have been looked at in a while, to also thinking about how to use the curbs more efficiently and more effectively. So you see our email addresses there. And Charles and I think would welcome contact from anyone in the audience. Also, if you just Google us at UNC, you'll also see our contact information there as well, so you don't necessarily need to write it down right now. We're about to transition to the Q&A portion. But before we transition, there is a short survey that Stride would like you to complete to think about their development of future webinars. So what I'm going to do is turn on to that slide so you can see the web link, and Ondine will also be putting it in the chat box, so you'll just be able to copy it from the chat box. And what I would ask you is consider completing the survey, but also consider, as you're doing that, think about questions that you might have for the group that Charles and I could answer, as well as we could solicit feedback from others who are on this call. So thank you. It's been great to talk about this, and also thanks to Stride for organizing this event. So here, as I said, is the short survey. Is a Qualtrics survey through the University of Florida. And we are also ready now to start answering some of the questions through the chat window. So I'll let you take 30 seconds or so just to make sure everybody got that web link and has time to think about their questions. Okay, so I think we'll go ahead and start answering the first question that's in the chat box, and hopefully others can also be entering in their questions. And that's one from Dan asking what happened to UPS using cargo bikes in CBD areas. Charles, did you want to take this one? I can also mention some other stuff after you're done.
Yeah, I'll start off, Maureen. So this was, they had pilot programs in Portland and Pittsburgh, and there may have been some others. I believe that they still have one that's underway in Manhattan. The problem they ran into was not technological. It was from the planners and the code writers of those two communities, as I understand, in that the cargo bikes did not fit the quote unquote definition of a bicycle. And there was a lot of consternation in how do we actually manage these operations, because the vehicle that is being used, it wasn't that the communities were against the idea, but they just didn't fit into the definition. So that is something that I believe that UPS is continuing to work on through their government affairs teams to help communities understand what these cargo bikes are. They are used in Europe extensively, primarily in Germany, and that's where they started. UPS see a great advantage of using the equipment, but it's more of a definition, if you will, of are these road vehicles? Are they not road vehicles? Where can they operate, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
And I think there's not only some of the large logistics firms working around cargo bikes, there are some specific startups focusing in that area. Another collaborator of mine, Chris Cherry from the University of Tennessee, has been working with a cargo bike provider delivery service in Portland. And so one of the things, I think this gets at what Charles was talking about, is thinking about how bike lanes are considered. And one way to think about them is that instead of bike lanes, cities that have networks that favor low speed mobility, of which cargo bikes could be one usage, as could regular bikes, but thinking about how cities that have built that network are actually have really been able to be very effective in meeting some of these new challenges or new modes that we've seen. Same thing for scooters, right? It's increasingly clear that it's difficult for us to predict what the new modes will be. And so thinking about having low speed infrastructure that can be used flexibly is important. So the next question from Barbara is anyone thinking about differential pricing for parking to discourage spaces that could be used as loading zones? And so, yes, I mean, in many ways, the curb management tools are a pricing mechanism. And then also many cities are implementing their own sort of auto parking policies, which may, in some cases, actually vary throughout the day or just be responsive. So I think you're right that price is one mechanism that it's clear that behavior is responsive to. Gerald said, can you address the issue of actually getting delivery drivers to use the available loading spaces both on street and off street? I think I'll punt this one to Charles and get his commentary first.
Sure, okay. So having been a driver, that's how I started way back when the dinosaurs were around. I can say on behalf of the drivers, we would want to and prefer to use the spaces that are available. In most cases, they're close to where we have to either make the pickup or deliver the shipment. And that means that we're more efficient. You know, we don't literally get yelled at when we get back because we've taken too much time. Get back to the sort center of the building, as it's called. I know that in my experience way back when, I would prefer off street because my vehicle was less likely to be damaged. by someone who was just driving down the road. And it was typically more secure because I'm not carrying just one package, I'm carrying many packages. The challenge that we find in the discussions that we had in Charlotte with UPS, specifically when we were addressing this issue, is somebody is already using that parking space. And typically they are not authorized to use the parking space, and so it's an enforcement issue. If the parking spot is enforced, it's only available for the delivery drivers. Believe me, the delivery driver will use it. It's safer, it's more secure. This is both for on-street and off-street. But there isn't a policeman there at all times to make sure that whoever it is who shouldn't be in that space and is using the space receives a citation or a ticket or whatever the process is. So love to use them, but they're not always available.
Great, thanks, Charles. So Ruth asked the next question. It's a really interesting question. It's about how many of us have probably seen examples either in the newspaper or in our own communities of streets being turned essentially into food courts, right? So you can order from any business on the street. Sometimes they're shared, sometimes they're dedicated to a restaurant. And thinking about how this interacts with urban deliveries, because while that street furniture is not permanent, it's certainly not movable on a daily basis. And so Ruth, I have to say that honestly, I actually had not thought about this. I think, it's one of those things, what cities will to accommodate the need for shared outdoor seating are ones some mechanism for getting the deliveries to the businesses, and that's largely going to mean probably longer walks for the driver, or if they do have off-street infrastructure or alleys or some other mechanism, they're going to be able to be a little bit more efficient with it. But I think it would be really interesting to go and actually talk to some of the communities and see if this has emerged as an issue, because it's one of those that people might not always think about in advance as they're planning those areas. Charles, did you have anything you wanted to add on that?
Yeah, the only thing I can think of is most of course, this outdoor experiment, because of COVID, is, as it's been noted by Ruth in her question, it's for restaurant activities, and restaurants don't want deliveries during meal times. They want it before they start serving food. So, and usually they have a back entrance that goes straight into the kitchen. But if it's, and I'm thinking of Apex, the main street in Apex, the entire main street is blocked off for restaurants, and it's also blocked off for non-restaurants. And so that's a really fascinating question. And when I happened to be in Apex a couple of weeks ago having lunch, I didn't even think about it. But yeah, it's definitely something where there needs to be, again, as was mentioned in the presentation, getting all the stakeholders together and coming up with a solution. Great question.
So Kim has the next question to hear a little bit about break bulk and freight lockers as a mitigation for freight delivery contexts in tighter urban areas. And so, Kim, what I think you're getting at is some of the strategies around urban consolidation centers that cities may require providers, and they will often the city will have to dedicate space for this, and then require that the delivery services use that space in order to be more efficient and not do it on the street. The example that comes to mind, and I'd be curious about Charles, to me is Paris. I think they're the ones that's often cited as doing the most in this area. The reviews that I've seen of it is it is incredibly challenging, because the firms often don't want to go into a shared space because they don't have the control that they may feel they need to have to meet their delivery timelines, as well as safety and security timelines. And then I think the Paris data also showed that it was more expensive. So there fits, there may have been reductions in greenhouse gases, there may have been reductions in air pollutants, there may have been reductions in congestion, but it was not as efficient, meaning that the government, if they wanted it to continue, would have to subsidize it. And so it becomes a fairly complicated question in that case.
Yeah.
Charles, was there anything you wanted to add there?
The idea of sharing, not necessarily lockers, but even sharing vehicles, and Noreen, you mentioned it with Professor Sherritt's research he's been doing in London for the last 5 years, I guess it is. There was actually a program that was instituted in the United States, I want to say 5, 6 years ago by CVS, where they went to all of their suppliers and said, you will share trucks. You will not send me a separate truck. So one from ABC suppliers and DEF suppliers, especially if they were half utilized. And it made the operations at the CVS, more of the distribution centers, more efficient. There was, needless to say, lots of rumbling. It still is underway, and it's made everything more efficient. Fewer vehicles on the road. 2 potential competitors have to coordinate their efforts, but it is getting done. And I think this is probably something that people in Paris, much less the work that's been done in London, have to go and benchmark and see how did they do it, what were the issues, and then how can we take that to an urban environment. Again, if a UPS package and a FedEx package are side by side, the packages don't care because they can't talk. But there's always the worry by those companies that if I'm UPS and a FedEx driver sees my package, he's going to write down all of the details, and then their salespeople are going to try and steal that flow. So that's a commercial issue that really needs to be addressed. That's part of this whole process of making things more efficient.
So Dan asks a short but very difficult question about what is the ideal level of enforcement in loading zones. And I think there's a few things to think about here. Charles highlighted this earlier. One is the extreme temporal sensitivity, right? You know, the driver isn't necessarily, there aren't necessarily delivery drivers going to every location all the time. The problem is it occupied when they're there, which means an expensive proposition if you're asking the police to enforce it because it's difficult to know when they need to be available. And then there's the issues of whether it's effective or not. You know, what's the value of that ticket, right? I think in most major cities, there's a lot of enforcement done of the freight companies for double parking and stuff like that. But it's essentially, my understanding is almost sort of a cost of doing business because there literally would be no other way that they could accomplish their tasks. So I'm going to kind of punt on that one. Charles, did you want to say anything more?
I believe that UPS, I think my number is correct, in their budget for New York City, budgets $100 million in parking fines a year. It's just the cost of doing business. So, you know, because they know that they'll show up and their space, well, the proper space is more than likely to be occupied. So they just say, we'll pay the fine, but we still need to deliver the packages.
Mm-hmm. And so Patrick asks a question about getting into details of how you would think about allocation to freight uses for loading zones versus parking, and how does that vary across in different land use contexts. So a really critical question, you know, how do you actually get this done? And I think probably the lesson here is to go back to some of the work of Don Shoup, right? So in setting parking policy, he says you should price it such that 15% of the spaces are always open, right? His Goldilocks principle. And nobody can tell you what that ratio is or what that price is. It's going to vary from street to street, from time of day. But how do you want it to function? What type of delay in terms of people looking for parking, what time of delay in terms of freight vehicles looking for parking, and then presumably pricing it accordingly or changing the availability of the parking space is important in a related manner. So it's more about thinking about what do you want the outcomes to be, how do you want the system to function, setting those metrics, and then iteratively and adaptively playing with the controls that you might have, which in this case, as you suggest, is the ratio between passenger vehicle and freight parking, as well as potentially the price, at least in some communities. Because I think, I'm guessing it's incredibly heterogeneous, at least as we've seen parking, passenger vehicle parking is. So.
Right. There's one resource that I came across. It's from where I was born. The Ontario Ministry of Transport actually came out with a planning document maybe 8-9 years ago, and it does address this specific issue, not necessarily for on-street parking, but for off-street parking. I noticed my colleague Ahmed Zarani is on. Ahmed now has that document in the office at NCDOT, but it might be of interest if someone wants to see at least what the thought process was from a freight perspective. And this whole document addressed the handling of freight in a wide variety of residential, industrial, commercial environments. So.
Great. So I think we need to stop there for the questions. We do have one last slide that lists the upcoming STRIDE webinars, as well as the web link so that you can see future ones as well. But I did want to say thank you. Those questions were really great and really engaging. I think we're all going to now start asking questions when if we go to any of those outdoor seating areas, ask them about their freight. So thanks so much to Ondine, thanks to STRIDE, and Charles, thank you for co-presenting as well.
Thanks, everybody. It's been fun.